It was a packed flight from New York to Los Angeles. The passengers were settling into their seats, placing their luggage in the overhead compartments, and getting comfortable for the long journey ahead. Flight attendants moved up and down the aisles, ensuring everyone was seated and ready for takeoff. Among the travelers was James Carter, a well-dressed black man in his early 40s. He wore a navy blue suit, polished shoes, and a wristwatch that gleamed subtly under the cabin lights. With an air of quiet confidence, he walked down the aisle, looking for his seat. But before he could settle in, trouble was already brewing. In seat 7B, a middle-aged white woman named Karen Whitmore sat with her arms crossed tightly, her face set in an expression of obvious displeasure. She had platinum blonde hair styled perfectly, designer sunglasses perched atop her head, and a luxury handbag resting in her lap. The moment she saw James stop at the seat beside her, her lips curled in visible annoyance. James glanced at his first-class boarding pass, then back at the seat. 7A. This was his spot, but the woman didn't give him a chance to sit. "Oh no," Karen huffed, her voice loud enough for surrounding passengers to hear. "There must be some mistake." James blinked, confused. "Excuse me." She narrowed her eyes. "You must be lost. This is first class." James kept his composure. "Yes, ma'am, I'm aware. This is my seat." Karen scoffed, shaking her head. "I don't think so. People like you don't belong up here. Maybe check in the back?" A hush fell over the nearby passengers. Some turned their heads, others pretended not to hear. The flight attendants had yet to reach their section, leaving an awkward silence between them. James took a slow breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "Ma'am, I assure you, this is my assigned seat." Karen rolled her eyes dramatically. "This is unbelievable. First class isn't just handed out to—" Before she could finish her sentence, a flight attendant arrived just in time to defuse the situation. "Is there a problem here?" Karen immediately put on her best polite voice. "Yes, there is. I think this gentleman is confused about where he's supposed to sit." The flight attendant took James's ticket, checked the seat number, and then turned back to Karen with a professional but firm tone. "Sir is exactly where he's supposed to be." Karen's face turned red. "Well, there must be some mistake. I mean, I paid good money for this seat, and I don't feel comfortable sitting next to him." James sighed, shaking his head. He had experienced prejudice before, but rarely so openly. The flight attendant's lips pressed into a thin line. "Ma'am, your options are simple. You can remain in your assigned seat, or I can have you escorted off the plane." Gasps rippled through the first-class cabin. Karen's eyes widened. She wasn't expecting consequences. I, she stammered, looking around for support. I just assumed—" But before she could continue, another voice interrupted. A man across the aisle, who had been quietly watching the entire exchange, stood up. "Actually, I'd like to switch seats with Mr. Carter," he said smoothly. Karen's face lit up. "Oh, that would be wonderful." But then her smile dropped, because as the man moved forward, she recognized his face. It was Michael Reynolds, the CEO of the very airline they were flying on. Karen's mouth fell open. James, however, was unfazed. He simply shook Michael's hand. "Good to see you again," James said with a polite smile. Karen's jaw nearly hit the floor, because James Carter wasn't just any passenger. He was a multimillionaire, a former Air Force pilot, and a top-ranking executive in the aviation industry. The very reason first class even existed on this airline was due to his contributions. Karen's arrogance melted into humiliation. She was suddenly fidgeting in her seat, looking around as if hoping no one had heard what she said earlier. But it was too late. The other passengers whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads. Others gave James approving nods. James simply adjusted his seatbelt and ignored Karen completely. Michael Reynolds turned to the flight attendant. "I think Mr. Carter deserves an apology." Karen's face turned an even deeper shade of red. She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. I, I'm sorry. James didn't even look at her. He just nodded. Good. Now let's enjoy the flight. The moment was over, but the lesson would never be forgotten. Sometimes people reveal their true colors in moments of assumed superiority, and sometimes karma is delivered at 35,000 feet in the air.